VTI and VOO are beloved by investors, but which is best for you? VTI is the ticker for the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. VOO is the ticker for the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. From the names alone, you can see similarities. Both funds are exchange-traded funds. ETFs allow you to buy a ton of different investments in a single purchase. These days, ETFs have become very popular because they typically don't have transaction fees and help investors easily create a well-diversified portfolio. Vanguard is the fund company managing these ETFs. Vanguard is the second largest ETF provider in the world and has a stellar reputation. Funds that have a reputable fund provider are less likely to be poorly designed or to come with high fees. The investing strategy for each ETF is different, with VTI being a total market fund and VOO being an S&P 500 fund. Before we dive into that, there are more similarities you need to know about. Both ETFs' expense ratios are 0.03%, meaning you will spend $3 for every $10,000 you have invested in the ETF every single year. This is an incredibly low expense ratio. The less you pay to a fund company, the more of the investment's return you get to keep for yourself. A good rule of thumb is to keep your investment's expense ratio under 0.1%. Both ETFs are index funds. Unlike an active fund, where you're paying someone to stock pick for you, index funds copy an index. Not only does this style of investing often come with low fees, but you also don't have the risk of investing your money with a bad stock picker. These are both domestic stock funds, meaning they are investing in US stock. You will need to invest in additional funds to build a well-diversified portfolio. These ETFs share so many similarities that even their popularity is similar. VOO is the third most popular ETF in the world, and VTI is the fourth most popular. With so many similarities between the two funds, the main difference between VOO and VTI is how they invest. Except, even that is similar. VOO tracks the S&P 500 index. The S&P 500 represents 500 of the largest US companies. We're talking Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, Google, Johnson & Johnson, and so many more. The index is market weighted, so the larger companies make up more of the index. For example, Apple represents around 7% of the S&P 500 index because Apple is so large. ExxonMobil represents around 1.3% because Exxon is smaller than Apple. Therefore, Exxon gets less representation. VTI tracks the CRSP US Total Stock Market Index. This index aims to represent approximately 100% of the investable US stock market. Instead of buying up just 500 companies, VTI buys around 4,000. The CRSP US Total Stock Market Index is a market-weighted index. For example, Apple represents around 6% of the CRSP Total Market Index because Apple is so large. Exxon represents around 1.1% because Exxon is smaller than Apple. If you're paying close attention, you just realized how similar both funds are. Even though on paper the investing strategy is different, the investment percentages of each stock is surprisingly similar. While VTI invests in thousands of companies, the fund is mostly invested in the S&P 500 companies. The S&P 500 index represents roughly 80% of the US stock market. Since VTI copies the stock market, roughly 80% of VTI's portfolio is invested in the S&P 500 companies. The reason you don't generally want both VTI and VOO in the same portfolio is because VTI does everything VOO does and a little bit more. If you invest in VTI, adding VOO to your portfolio does not increase your diversification while making your portfolio more complicated. All this investment overlap means that each fund's performance is going to be very similar. When you look at the 10-year returns for VTI versus VOO, the annual returns are within 1% of each other. Now, I hope you aren't about to use the 10-year performance to pick between VTI and VOO. You know enough at this point to be smarter than that. As an investor, you need to fixate on the future. Perhaps in the next decade, large companies will outperform again. On the other hand, perhaps it's time for mid and small-sized companies to shine. But you don't know the future, so then how can you figure out which fund is better for you? For most investors, your goal is to build a well-diversified, low-cost portfolio. You don't know what the next hot stock will be, but if you buy everything, you won't miss out. Each fund you invest in is a puzzle piece used to build a diverse portfolio. Looking at VTI and VOO from this perspective, the difference is clear. VTI is great for people who want to manage some funds but also keep it pretty simple. A diversified portfolio using VTI might only have 3 funds in total. VTI is buying up the entire US stock market, so you would only be missing exposure to international stocks and bonds. VOO is only buying large US companies, so you would need international stocks, bonds, and all the missing US stocks. You could buy a mid-cap fund, which buys mid-sized companies, and a small-cap fund, which buys small-sized companies. Alternatively, you could buy an extended market fund, which is a fund that invests in everything an S&P 500 index fund doesn't buy. I personally chose to invest in VTI because I value simplicity in my portfolio. The extra headache of figuring out how much S&P 500 versus mid-cap versus small-cap my portfolio needs and then rebalancing it just isn't worth my time. Additionally, I save a bit of money because mid-cap and small-cap funds often have higher expense ratios than 0.03%. For example, Vanguard's mid-cap ETF's expense ratio is 0.04%. Vanguard's small-cap ETF's expense ratio is 0.05. Vanguard's extended market ETF is 0.06. VTI gives me simplicity and slightly lower fees. What's not to love? If you have already invested in one of these funds and want to make a switch, please be careful of taxes and fees. If the ETF is in a non-retirement account and you've accrued a large capital gain, it may be financially wise to leave the ETF alone and just start investing into the fund you want. At this point, you might be realizing that both ETFs are not for you. You might not want to manage a portfolio of funds yourself. Fortunately, there are alternatives. For example, target date funds are a type of fund where the fund invests in other funds, giving you a complete portfolio in a single investment. It's like getting a puzzle pre-built for you. All you need to know is the rough year you plan to retire, and then buy the fund that is close to that year. You should also consider a financial advisor or robo-advisor. Either service will buy you a complete portfolio of funds on your behalf. That requires even less work than a target date fund, but you should expect to pay more in fees as a result. If this video helped you understand the difference between VTI and VOO, then consider subscribing so you can learn even more. I wish you well with your journey towards financial success.